views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of Access Fort Wayne, the Allen County Public Library, or any other supporting groups. If you'd like to produce a show, call us at 260-421-1250.
Let me be your lighthouse so I can show you the way. Let me be your shining light, I'll keep you from drifting away. I'm the one that makes you try when...
Okay, this is Patty Hunter of Patty's Page. Today's guests will be Ralph Vincent Morales and Michael Reagan. So both are here to talk about themselves and Ralph's late uncle. What's his last name? Vincent or Vinnie? Benore Saint. What's the last name?
Santaniello.
Santaniello. Oh, that's
Yes.
good. What does that mean? Saint?
That's what they called him.
That was his
Oh.
nickname in Vietnam.
Oh. Well, Ralph, you are the author of a recently released book about your late Uncle Vinnie called A Saint's Letters from the Depths of Hell. That must be rough to do.
Yes.
And Michael, you knew Vinnie back in the 1960s in Vietnam, or shall we just?
No, I've known him since the 60s.
Oh, yeah. So in Nam, we'll call it instead of Vietnam. Ralph, where were you born and raised?
I was actually born and raised in a borough of New York City. Queens was the borough, and I was born and raised in Jamaica, Queens, back in 1969. And I was born and raised in the same house that my uncle lived in before he was sent off to Vietnam.
How old was he when he went over to Nam?
He left in the summer of 67. He was 18.
Wow. While growing up, who influenced you the most?
Well, what's interesting is I grew up, like I said, in the same house Vinnie grew up in. So his parents were my grandparents, Rose and Carmine Santaniello. And his dad, my grandfather Carmine, was by far the biggest influence in my life. He was very instrumental in helping me grow up. He never really mentioned, obviously, losing his son. That was something that was very close and obviously a great tragedy to him. But he was a phenomenal man to me. He was, people say, was he a second father? He was more of a first father than a second father to me. But a wonderful man, a very, very loving man, a tough, old school man for sure. But very loyal to his family, very loving, and would do anything for us, his grandkids, for sure, no doubt. And I learned a great deal about family from my grandfather, Carmine.
Oh, so did Vinnie have any siblings?
Yes, he did. My mother was his oldest sister. My mother's actually on the cover of the book. The letters from Saint were to my mother, Lilly. So that was...
Your mother's Lilly?
Yes. Yes, and Vinnie also had a younger brother, also named Carmine. So my mother was the oldest of three siblings.
So, Michael, we don't want to forget you now. Where were you born? Just to rehash. I did an interview with him for a little while ago, but Michael, where were you born?
Seattle, Washington, 1947.
And when you first became aware of your late uncle and what he had done, how old were you? Well,
it's interesting. I would say I was a young kid, but I never really got to know my uncle. Growing up, he was more myth than man to me and to my siblings, primarily because of the fact that he was torn away from my family, my grandparents, my mother, her brother. And it was a tragedy that I'm sure affected them very profoundly. So profoundly, in fact, that they very rarely spoke about him. There were pictures of Vinnie up in the house. And I remember as a child, I would look up at these pictures and I knew that Vinnie was killed in a war. Again, I was very young and I was born I was born right toward the end of the Vietnam War. But again, I didn't have much of a concept of what that was like. So I would look up at these photos of Vinnie, and he was about 18, 19 in the pictures. But I was thinking, oh my God, he must have been such an old man. Like right now I'm 52. So I was thinking, oh, he must have been a 50-year-old man. What an old guy. So I didn't really have context of Vinnie. So while I knew who he was in terms of, the man that was away in war and who died in war, no one spoke about him, sadly.
Yeah.
So it was a situation where
It's
they were
very
obviously
tender.
very, they were very terribly impacted by his death. And I think in many ways, they just couldn't gather up the strength or really want to revisit that terrible time in their life. Because again, I was born 16 months after Vinnie was killed. So I'm sure they were still healing throughout that time. And in fact, they probably were healing the rest of their lives, truly, from losing Vinnie.
When was Vinnie born?
He was born on September 20th, 1948.
1948.
Yes.
He would have been 73 if he was still kicking it
Yeah.
out. My
Yeah.
husband's 72, so he was born in 49. So, how old was he when he was shipped over to Nam?
He was 18 in the
18?
summer of 67. Yeah, it was right before his 19th birthday. And he was killed on March 28th of 1968. He was 19 when he was killed.
And how did you meet up with Vinnie, Michael? Where'd you meet?
Well, he was the company driver in Vietnam. He was the lifeline between the rear area, the administration. To make it simple, he was the contact between the administration and the frontline guys, and I was one of the frontline guys. So we saw Vinnie usually every day, but not every day. And his thing was whatever information had to be brought from the rear to the front, he brought it. Mostly we loved him because he brought mail usually. So we lived on our mail and packages that we would be able to get. We were like as far out as you possibly could from anything civil. And so to see Vinnie was like a little bit of heaven.
Mm.
So we met him right away. I mean,
His
we
personality?
knew him as the mailman.
What was his personality like? Very outgoing and loving and
He's a Marine.
compassionate?
He was a Marine.
Marine.
He knew his job. He did it really well. He knew how important what he was doing was for us. We all loved him. He knew it. Let me say that again. We all loved him and he knew it. So when he was getting close to coming home,
Yeah.
it was important for him to always, to come out and say goodbye to all of us. He couldn't just leave. And because he knew how much we depended upon him. In fact, the day he died, that's what he was basically doing, coming out to say goodbye to all of us.
The Lord had different ideas for Vinnie, didn't he?
Yeah, ideas that didn't actually materialize for about 45 years until 45 years later,
And then,
which is a huge story in itself, which is in the book. Ralph has put it into the book as a part of the book, that part that's not fictional. And all that's going on right now that has Ralph and I as family. I see him as my nephew, although he's a year younger than my son.
oh,
I think that the day Vinnie died, and we'll talk more about this in a minute, I'm sure.
yeah.
He didn't die. He passed on something to me that brought us all together today.
And
That actually created the 7 portraits I've sent out this week
wow.
to fallen hero families around the country.
So behind you, Michael, the picture of Uncle Vinnie.
Right there.
Yeah.
That picture is actually next to my drawing table down in my studio. And whenever I do anything on TV, what I do is I bring it up and put it right where it's at so everybody can see it.
And I can see behind you, Ralph.
Yes,
picture
indeed.
of Uncle Vinnie as well in your book.
Yes, Michael was very gracious to present me with the portrait of my uncle back during the celebration of the 10th anniversary of Michael's Fallen Heroes Project. It was in Washington. And I can't say enough about that photo. Everyone that sees it is mesmerized by it. But more importantly, it keeps my uncle alive. And as Mike has explained to many Gold Star families, it is his gift to them to bring their fallen hero back home. And in many ways, people that have lost loved ones, look at that photograph and they feel a sense of dignity and pride and respect and love and some sense of closure. The reason why that portrait is important to me is obvious. He was my uncle, but he was an uncle that I never got to meet. I never got to love my uncle. I never got to laugh with him and joke with him and have him make fun of me, things like that, kidding around with me. But it's up there now as a reverent sign of respect. Thanks to Michael for presenting me with that portrait. I feel Uncle Vinnie's presence every day when I'm down here, for sure.
Vincent's last words to me when I held him were, "Mike, I just want to go home." He said, he just looked me in the face and he said, "Mike, I want to go home." And then he died. And I think, I appreciate what Ralph just said, but I've been looking at that picture since Ralph's picture that showed up on the screen. And what that picture represents to me is Vincent's wish coming true. That picture represents to me Vinnie being home. And it took us, like I said, 4.5 decades to get it done, but it's finished and there he is and he's there. And he's actually part of, I listened to something Ralph said the other day, was incredible what he said. He's a part of, I've done over 8,000 portraits of fallen heroes around the world.
That's your mission.
I've done every soldier that died in the country of Poland. All these people have the portraits just like Ralph does right there, hanging on their wall. As a part of every one of those portraits, Vincent Santaniello's soul is in them.
Because he was the one that but had you starting to draw. Was he the first one you drew?
No, there was a young corpsman, Marine corpsman who died in Iraq in 2003, Michael Johnson. But what Vinnie did was he put an image inside of me when I was a kid that day,
right,
that you can read in the book, and it's very well put together. He put something inside of me that I wasn't mature or old enough to understand until, like I said, four decades later, when I was asked to make a decision that I made in a couple of seconds. And the reason I made the decision was because I remembered the mailman. I remember him looking at me and I remember him wanting to go home, and I'm thinking, didn't even realize it yet, but I knew deep down what I was thinking is this was my opportunity to keep a promise I made to him, get him home. And in fact, the night that I presented that picture to Ralph, I told him, I said, what this picture represents to me now is my keeping my promise to Vinnie. But he's my muse. The same feelings that Ralph will tell you about with his family and the trauma and the broken hearts and everything else. Those are the same feelings with all the fallen heroes that I've drawn. And what Vinnie's doing is helping me bring them some closure, just like Ralph, just like he was just saying a minute ago.
Closure, that's right.
That's what it's about. That's why the book is so important. It's really important to me. In the book, I'm known as Red. That was my nickname. Red? Yeah, because of my flowing red hair, obviously.
Oh, I don't
as my wife said the other day, I may not look like it, but I'm a ginger.
Oh.
But I think what Ralph did in the book was he presented, even though it's fiction, what Ralph did was he presented an incredibly clear picture of what that time was like when his uncle passed away. And that's significant because when you read it and you understand what he's actually trying to say, and it's the feeling you'll get reading it, and I totally recommend it.
It's very strong.
That's what we operated under. The environment that he presents in the book may be fictional, but it wasn't fictional to us who were there, because there were episodes like that and feelings like that, and the loss of Vincent.
Yes.
Okay. 3 other Marines died at that same time. One of them I visit who's buried in Seattle, Peter Armstrong. I visit his grave all the time.
Yes. But
that's the kind of loss young kids were realizing. And Ralph in the book does a perfect job of explaining it. So much so that we have friends of ours who are angry because they're not in the book. because they were a part of all of that. You know what I mean?
Well, your mother received a lot of letters from Uncle Vinnie. What were some of them like? I mean, he described what was going on in with him in Vietnam War? I mean, how do we get to know your Uncle Vinnie?
Well, you know, what's interesting is that my mother never shared those letters with us when she was alive. So
Oh,
I never knew about them. She had passed away in July of '02. And while my siblings and I were going through her belongings, we came across these letters. It was a box, and I'd never seen this box before.
mhm.
I opened the box, and inside were dozens of letters. And so
Wow.
I'm reading these letters, and for the first time, I'm hearing Vinnie's voice. And I realized tragically that my mother and Vinnie were absolute best friends just by the tenor of the letters. I realized for the first time, really, he wasn't just some old man. He was a young man. He was a kid,
Yeah.
right? He was a man child, really, when you think about it. He was an 18-year-old doing really, really amazing things, you know, amazingly frightening things in Vietnam.
Well, he
And
fought. Did he fight?
well, from my understanding, he was the company driver, but he was present for obviously different things that were going on in Vietnam. He wasn't on the front lines necessarily like Mike and a few other individuals that are mentioned in the book,
Yeah.
but I could tell by what he was writing that he had witnessed many things that, you know, the vast majority of us will never A, witness, or B, even be able to imagine or comprehend what men like Michael went through as young men. So I was reading these letters, and I realized, my God, there's so much about Vinnie and Lilly, my mother, that I
Yeah.
had no concept of. So that inspired me to write the letters. But when you read them, I think in many ways, there were a few where Vinnie was honest about what he had seen. But for the most part, I believed, and after speaking with Michael and Michael's peers that were in Vietnam, I realized that he really did homogenize the letters, so to speak. He tried to make them sound much blander, that Vietnam was not nearly as dangerous as what it really was, because he knew if he told his sister and his parents the absolute truth, they would be mortified by what he was going through, what he was experiencing, what he was seeing
You
on a
want
daily basis. Absolutely.
The other people that were friends of your uncle, Michael, who were they? There's Doc, you.
Doc John Nunn, of course, he's one of my close dear friends, and Tony Milazzo was the other corpsman, and again, one of my close friends. But there was many of us. Dennis King, there was a ton of us, all young kids, you know, in an environment that was impossible to describe. And I think Ralph does a really good job in the book of it. That's what I think is important here. Ralph actually has to write a book that's fictional about something that really happened, because as another author told me one time, well known, he said, if I'd have said this was nonfiction, nobody would have believed it when they read it. The violence that was in Vietnam is indescribable, even to the best writer. Ask Joe Galloway, another writer that was a friend of mine. You try, but at the point where people stop reading because it's too hard to read.
It is hard. I had trouble going through that book, Ralph.
I have Gold Star mothers who I've warned. I said, get the book, but be careful when you read certain chapters.
Yeah,
But that's real. Ralph did a great
I
job.
know. It saddened me, and yet you're telling a great story about your Uncle Vinnie, and our condolences for him passing before you even had a chance to meet him. When did you start writing the book?
Well, so I found his letters in '02, and I was inspired to try to write the book. But at the time, I literally had no context of who Vinnie was, whether as a Marine or as a young man before going to Vietnam. So I spent the better part of a decade trying to find people, doing a lot of research, going online, trying to find people that knew my uncle in Vietnam. And for the most part, I would run into people that would say, you know, Vinnie was a really nice guy, but I don't really have a lot of memories, you know, because it was so long. Obviously, it was more than 40 years later.
Wow.
So it was very fortuitous that in January of 2014, I got a phone call from a reporter out on the West Coast. He was in LA. And the reporter asked me if I was Vinnie Santaniello's nephew, which was an odd question. So I'm like, yeah, sure. You know, who are you?
Yeah.
He's like, well, I'm a reporter for ABC News. And I just did a really big piece on this gentleman up in Seattle, Michael Reagan. and you might want to give him a call. He might have some things to share with you about your uncle. Now, mind you, I had not met Michael, obviously. I didn't know who he was at the time, but I had met many other individuals. So my thought going into my phone call with Mike was that it was just going to be another one of those situations where someone would say, you know what, your uncle was a really nice guy, but I really don't have much more to offer you. And that's what I went into the phone call expecting. So I called Mike, and I'll never forget the way the phone call started. He answered the phone, and right away, as I'm sure you've heard already, Mike's voice, maybe his wife Cheryl may disagree, but his voice has got a very Zen-like quality, very soothing, very
yes.
calming.
He's a calm guy.
Absolutely. So Mike gets on the phone and he said, "Are you Vinnie Santaniello's nephew?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And then the next thing Mike said was, "I want you to understand that your uncle was in no pain when he died."
Oh,
And that was the way the conversation began. And I've shared this with Mike many times, and he's heard this, I'm sure, many times, but I was literally awestruck by that. I almost could not get any further words out, because at that point I realized this wasn't going to be what I expected. This was a man who had intimate contact with my uncle.
yeah.
And as I learned, was actually with my uncle when he passed away. My uncle died in Michael's arms. And the next thing Michael said was, "I want you to know that your uncle was surrounded by people that loved him and that he loved, and he was not alone, and he was in no pain." And that was sort of how the conversation began. And it was a conversation that, it happened almost 7 years ago. 25 years, 50 years from now, I'll never forget the nature of that phone call. I went from not knowing Michael to becoming Michael's family. And that's the way it began. And that's what served as the real genesis, the real impetus to now I could write the book, because I eventually went out to Seattle, and I'm sure we'll get into it, but I met Michael, I met Doc Nunn, I eventually met Doc Tony Milazzo, spoke with Daniel King, and I met other individuals that knew my uncle. So I went from not having any context of who Vinnie was to ample context, many stories. Michael, John Nunn, Tony Milazzo, Daniel King. There was a John Chang who was friends with my uncle in Jamaica, Queens, before they both went off to Vietnam. And John Chang actually accompanied my uncle's body from Dover, Delaware, back up to New York for the funeral. And these men, they're all heroes to me, because they had the courage to share stories with me that I'm sure they didn't want to recount, because they had to go back into hell. They had to go back into that time where, people say, you live day to day. That's sort of a cliche today. Back then, they weren't living day to day. They were living, and Michael can say it much better than I, they were living nanosecond to nanosecond, because you never knew what was going to happen. And you don't try to survive for 5 minutes. You try to survive second by second. And so for them to have the courage and really the human decency to share those stories with me, without those stories, the book never gets written. Because when I wrote the book, I realized it was more than what I thought it was going to be. Initially, I thought it was just going to be a book about my uncle and my mother. Wow. And then I realized it was so much more than that, because my uncle,
life was opened up.
Right, absolutely, because my uncle was interwoven with everything that Michael has done through the Fallen Heroes Project. And like Michael said, every of his almost 9,000 portraits has a piece of Vinnie in them. So Vinnie may have left the earth on March 28th of 1968 when he passed away, but Vinnie's legacy is very much alive and well through the grace of God and Michael's amazing right hand with these portraits that he draws. So that really gave me the context and really the inspiration to begin writing. So I began to write the book a few years after I met with Michael, because I was still trying to get everything together. Yeah. And I ultimately finished it in January of 2018, the first draft in January of 2018.
So when was it released?
It was released in May of 2020.
Patty, I want to mention something. I don't want to forget about this. Can you go back to the picture of Ralph on the big screen there? For just a second.
Yeah.
I want you to look at that picture that's hanging behind Ralph. That's one of the two originals that I drew. One's mine, one's his. Right. But the one thing I recognize, I'm a portrait artist. I've been one for decades, 5 decades.
Boy.
I don't want people to miss this. Ralph was not born when Vinnie died. Ralph's middle name is after Vinnie. If you see the picture on the wall behind Ralph, and then you look at Ralph, you'll notice that those two guys look alike. Yeah. I don't want people to miss that.
Yeah, very much so.
Yep.
Is this on Amazon, dear?
It is. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes and Noble. I have it on a website. It's ralphvincentmorales.com. The book is available there as well. It's available anywhere you can get a book, really.
Because a friend of mine, the person that you talked to, Paul knew, like he said, he was in Vietnam being an entertainer, entertaining the troops. And he did see some action, but he's 81 now, eh? Wow. How old Uncle Vinnie would have been? I forgot.
I see he'd be 73 right now.
73. Oh, well, that's not very old. What would you like to talk about to share with my audience, both of you?
Well, you know what I'd like to say, and Michael touched on this before. People ask me, well, what kind of book is it? Is it a military book? And I always say, well, it is a military book, but it's really a book about human experiences. Because the one thing I learned in speaking with Michael and the gentleman that we talked about already, John Nunn and Tony Milazzo, these were young kids that were there. They were fiercely loyal to each other. They loved each other. They went from not knowing each other to being not only the best of friends, but the closest of brothers. And absolutely. And they lived, the experiences that they had were riveting. They were harrowing. And so when people ask me, what happens with the book? What's the book about? I tell them, you don't read the book, you experience the book. And the one thing that readers have told me, and I'm very proud of this, is that they feel that when they read the book, they're there. And it is a difficult read because I made it as real as I could based upon the stories that Michael shared with me and John and Tony and the heroes that are in my life. And it was difficult for them to share for sure, but I wanted the readers to understand that they have to experience it. So when you read the book, you are experiencing what these gentlemen experienced. And that is very important to me. And more importantly, that you experience the feeling that my family had when they lost their nephew and their son.
This is Paul New, who was in
Hi,
Vietnam.
Paul.
He's a singer, entertainer.
How are you, Paul?
For 63 years. Still doing it. Yeah, I was over there one time, and that's when the girl got shot, killed on stage. And they found out it was one of our own guys who didn't like one of the bosses in the camp, and he missed him and hit the girl. They got us out of there real quick. It was also on the actor. I don't know what the hell you call him.
You're SS John E. Kennedy.
I'm from Boston. Kennedy was, I love John Kennedy, and
John F.
I got to play on the deck of the ship's whites. And he's captain that I played for gave me one of these. When I go to the store, they try to give me free stuff. I said, I wasn't in the military. I just was an entertainer, entertaining military guys. I was in the Navy Air Force Base down in Puerto Rico and all the bases all over. We had a base in North Dakota. We had one in Sioux City, Iowa. We had one in Roosevelt Roads down in Puerto Rico.
How long were you in Vietnam? Just a week or what? Do you remember?
About 12 hours.
12 hours. So.
Hey, you sell this book on Amazon?
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
It is, yes.
I'll look it up. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Well, if you look it up, read it.
No, that's what I'm saying. I'm a reader.
Good, man. Good. I want to tell you something. So I want to just share the impact of Vietnam for a second. The book does an incredible job, but like I said, it's written as fiction, and people read it as that and think that Ralph made up a lot of the stories. His stories are the result of what he got out of a lot of conversations. Mm-hmm. But I've drawn, like I said, over 8,000, well, way over 8,000 portraits. I had a dad one time call me and he says, "What are you getting out of doing all these portraits?" And I said, "Nothing, I do them all for free." He says, "Now you're getting something out of them." And we went back and forth for probably 10 minutes. And what he was doing was angering me, and he knew he was, because he was a Gold Star dad, Marine, Vietnam veteran, who a year earlier had lost his son that I had drawn for him. And he said, well, I got you angry now. And I said, yep. And he says, so I want you to hear what I'm about to say. He said, you did get something out of this project. And I said, what's that? He said, your soul has gotten to come home from Vietnam. What's happened with Vietnam veterans, a piece of them doesn't come home. What I was trying to impress upon you is, I think the thing that people don't understand who weren't there is that there's this unseen piece of all of us. It's the life, it's the light that's inside of us. And what does that represent? Because I don't talk politics, but I have no hesitation in talking spirituality.
Yes.
The people that I work with, the families I work with, and the drawings that I do, I spend a long time looking into their faces and talking to all these soldiers who have given the most anybody has ever given. You hear about cost of war. The cost of war is that picture on Ralph's wall. It's that picture behind me. It's the picture on my right side. It's the cost is much greater, but it isn't realized by people who don't pay it. And sadly, there's a small group of people in this country who pay the price.
Yeah.
Ralph's one of them. And what I decided to do with my life was try and help people like Ralph, and it's worked. And it happened because a long time ago, March 28, 1968, Ralph's uncle looked into my face. And he didn't just say, Mike, I want to go home. What he was saying actually was, Mike, I'm going to give you something now. And I hope someday you're smart enough to understand what it is, because neither of us understand what's happening right now. And he looked me right in the face, just like I'm looking at you right now, Patty.
Yes, sir.
And he closed his eyes and went to heaven. I speak with him every day when I draw, because I've drawn a portrait every day for over 18 years of a fallen hero.
He's an artist.
And every one of those starts with a conversation. And my belief is Vinny's sitting right next to every one of those soldiers I've drawn, making sure I understand what I'm supposed to know. The reason Ralph and I are family is because the night before I was able to present his portrait to him, the one you see on that wall, he didn't get to see it. I wasn't going to show it to him till the next day. But he and I sat in my studio, and we talked about all of this. We went to spiritual instantly. He sat on the floor, I sat in my chair. And the one thing I'll never forget, Ralph said to me, he says, do you mean my uncle didn't die for no reason? And I said, I think there's a ton of families around this country who think your uncle died for a very great reason, because it's what's getting them, their family members, home.
How do you feel? How does your family feel about all these, the book and the picture of Uncle Vinnie?
Well, it's funny. I've shown everyone the photo of the portrait, I should say, and they're all just amazed. And there are cousins of Vinnie that haven't, obviously haven't seen him in many, many decades, and they saw this photo for the portrait for the first time, and they were like, "My God, it looks like he knew Vinnie. He must have been, part of Vinnie's life for such an amazing portrait." So they're all taken aback by the absolute sheer beauty and majesty of the portrait. And as far as the book goes, I feel that they are very proud because, again, they had their loved one torn from them, and they lost a great person. Everyone that I've spoken to in my family, all of his cousins that are still alive, they all say the same thing about Vinnie. He was sort of the leader of the family, and he was the next one. He was the next generation that was going to take the mantle, so to speak, and lead the family. And they were deprived of that opportunity. So when they read the book, they realize it's a great homage to Vinnie and to my mother, because my mother, they were very close with her as well. And then I explained to them, it's while it is that for sure, it's also an homage to those gold stars just like them that have lost loved ones. And it's an homage to those that have lost their lives, that made the ultimate sacrifice. And then finally, hopefully Mike feels this way, it's an homage to Mike and to John and to Daniel King and to Tony Milazzo, to John Chang, and all those men that left a big piece of their souls in Vietnam when they came back home. But it's a sign of respect and a sign of great love. Mike, like I've said to you, I can never fathom what you saw and what you experienced in Vietnam. And all I can hope is that my book does justice, even to a slight degree, because again, it can't be authentic because I wasn't there. But it's a showing of great love and respect for heroes like Mike, who gave up so much and who came home. And as you can see with Michael, he's dedicated his life to helping those that have lost loved ones since that time. And he continues to do so. It's an amazing human being. And I know Mike doesn't like the praise, and he tries to deflect it constantly. So Mike, I apologize, but I'm going to praise you just a little bit. But Michael, what he does completely selflessly and completely, hour by hour every day, is he sits down and he brings to life a loved one for a family. And when they receive those portraits, the tears flow, but they're tears of happiness and tears of relief because their loved one is back home.
Closure.
And Mike does all of that out of the love of his heart and out of the love for his country. I mean, Mike is still serving his country 50 plus years after he came home, and he will always serve through the wonderful work of the Fallen Heroes Project. And he deserves so much love and so much praise and so much respect for what he does. I mean, if you ask him, he'll deflect it. He doesn't want any of it, but he is an amazing man for the families that he serves. And if you look at the portrait over his right shoulder of the mom and the daughter, those are loved ones of a man who lost his life in service to our country.
Yes.
And there are so many people like the mom and daughter depicted in that photo, in that portrait, who owe and feel a great deal of gratitude and respect for Michael, for what he does for them and what he does for our country.
Nice to meet you. I'll give you back with that. Nice to meet you both.
You too,
Thank
man.
you.
Thanks for your service, helping us out.
No, I just-
Patty, I wanted to say something before this gets over.
Yes,
Can
sir.
I say something here?
Sure.
You see the medal I'm wearing around my collar? here?
Yes, sir.
This is the Civilian Medal of Honor.
Ah.
It's called the Citizen Service Before Self Honors, given once a year for service to someone by the Medal of Honor Society at Arlington, Virginia.
Who presented it to you? Who personally?
Two Medal of Honor recipients from Vietnam, and they presented it at Arlington on March 25th, 2015. You have to be nominated by people you don't I didn't even know how that was happening, but I know the person who started my nomination process for me to be wearing this medal, Ralph Morales.
So,
What Michael's talking about, the nomination, that was probably the easiest thing I ever had to do. So, because when you talk about a man that you love as much as I love Michael, and when you're nominating a man for something that he has brought, forget about me. It's not about me, and it's more about my uncle. But more importantly, it's about all of those people around the country and really around the world that don't know Michael but know him. If that makes sense, they don't know him, but they know him through his amazing gift of the Fallen Heroes Project and the amazing gift of his portrait. So really, the words just flowed. Michael embodies what that medal around his neck means. He has been serving us since he was in his early 20s. And I'm not going to give Mike's age away, but he's just a little bit older than 20 now. And he has been serving us, all of us, really.
Yeah.
That's a little bit.
Mike has been serving us for a very long time.
many
And
of
that medal is a great tribute to a great man, because while I will not minimize the others that received the medal, because they all received it for very righteous reasons, Michael embodies that medal. And the Fallen Heroes Project is really part and parcel of who Mike is as a human being. And there is not a finer human being wearing that medal today, in my humble opinion.
And if you read the book about Vinnie, you'll understand what drove me 45 years later to start the project that ended up putting this around my neck.
I read the book.
Then you'll know why we all loved Vincent Santaniello
Yes.
and the impact it had on us. That's lifelong.
Yes.
I had somebody tell me one time, they're all going to be there for you when you pass away.
Mhm.
And thinking about that
Mm-hmm.
is daunting. Think about, if you believe in God and you believe in a higher power, and I do,
I do.
and you do your best, and you're not always perfect. I'm not always perfect for sure, but you do your best to help people with pain, great pain.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. To realize that someday those people are going to hold you. They're going to be there when you need them to be there for you.
You're
It's
like
daunting.
a doctor. You are like a doctor to many people whose husbands and wives have died in the wars, drawing their portraits.
I believe totally, and I've told Ralph this, Vincent Santaniello and Mike Reagan have created portraits of fallen heroes that have gone to families who are on the verge of suicide who didn't die. That for whatever reason, the love, the support, the attention, whatever they got out of this picture kept them breathing.
Yes, kept them going.
Yep. And that's not me. Vinny is the guy in touch with the guy upstairs. You know what I mean? And what he's done is he gave me Ralph, and Ralph gave the country this book. And this book is a great read about not war. It's a great read about a wonderful human being that is as much a part of the Fallen Hero Project as I am.
Ralph, where's your email? I mean, your website. You have a website?
Yes, it's ralphvincentmorales.com. You'll meet Mike on that website as well. You can get the book on that website. There are photographs of my Uncle Vinnie, photographs of my mother, and it's really a good way to get an appreciation for experiencing the book when you do read it. And what I tell everybody is, this is a book that you'll experience, but it's a book that you will continue to experience well after you turn the final page, because it's going to touch you in ways that you never knew you could be touched by reading a book. And it really is an experience. And it was a great experience writing it. But more importantly, when I hear back from those that have read the book, I realize that they are experiencing it while they read it, and they continue to experience it well after the final page. The final page, which ironically enough, is Michael's portrait of Uncle Vinnie. I made sure that that would be the last page in the book because it really does bring it full circle.
Hold on, babe. There she goes.
Yep, there it is.
That's Uncle Vinnie.
I want to tell you something real quick. Long time ago, I was asked to be a part of another book. It was written by a psychologist whose only thing was to try and help people with trauma. It was written anonymously, but it was written as a Vietnam veteran. And these are the kind of calls, I'm sure, and letters that Ralph's receiving. One day in Denver, Colorado, in the middle of a bookstore, all of a sudden, this Vietnam veteran started screaming.
Oh.
And he started screaming, and I know this because he contacted me through the author of that book.
Yeah.
He was reading the chapter that I was in, chapter 13. And we were talking about the things that Ralph and I are talking about right now. We were talking about the things Ralph, without ever reading that book, has put into his book because of the realization of the spirituality of the work we're doing and that Vinny's a part of. And when somebody finally got over and calmed him down, he was crying, and he said, ever since I got home from Vietnam, this is all I've been trying to tell people.
What's been going over, done over.
What I'm going through, what I live with every day, not me, what he does. So all veterans, all Vietnam veterans, you hear all of these ways to prevent suicides, and we're all concerned about that totally. And a lot of us are involved in trying to stop all that. But sometimes what prevents somebody from killing themselves is just the knowledge that someone actually knows what they're going through, not try and fix them. What Ralph does in this book is he tells the reader, this is what all those Vietnam veterans that are still alive are going through, who actually were in combat. That's why the book's good to read. Young people should read this book, because when we're gone,
no one's going to know.
Who's going to tell them?
Yeah.
The fortunate thing for me in this book is this, and I've never shared this with Ralph because we don't, we're opposite ends of the coast. What Ralph's done is he's not just made Vincent immortal in that book. He's made Vietnam veterans immortal in that book if we can get people to read it.
Yes, sir.
We didn't fight in Vietnam because we hated the Vietnamese people. We went to Vietnam because we loved them. We thought we were doing something good, and we did. All of us did.
Yes,
and
sir.
some of us didn't get to come home, and people like Ralph and Ralph's family and many other families I work with have to live with a huge loss in their life.
Yes, sir.
What Ralph's book does is it teaches people that. That's an educational read.
It is.
Is it hard to read? You bet. But was
It is.
Vietnam hard? Vietnam was 100 times harder than that book was to read.
Yes, I know.
But
I
what
agree.
that book does is it describes to people,
Yeah.
this is what the costs were. And there's people like me and my friends and Doc and all the people that Ralph mentioned. We still live with those memories every day. I don't sleep well at night because I think about stuff, or I feel like I should be doing something more on my drawing table. But what Ralph does in the book is he teaches people that there are people in this country today, like me, like Malazzo, like Nunn, like Chang, all of us, okay, who every day think about the things that is written in that book as fiction. And to us, it's not fiction.
It is reality.
That's all I just need to say that.
Yes,
It's
sir.
important. It's much more important than just another book.
Yes, sir. It's history. It's
you.
the truth. In a way, it is. It's telling it like it is.
Ralph learned all of the things he learned and showed in that book
Mm-hmm.
since the beginning of the Fallen Hero Project. The pieces he needed, I remember that phone call. When I said to the ABC guy, give me Ralph's phone number so I can call him because I wanted to do Vinnie's portrait. And he says, you don't need to call him. I gave him your phone number. He's going to be calling you any minute. And he did.
Oh, my.
But what that led to was Ralph being educated as to what his uncle
Wait.
would have gone through, did go through, and would have been like if he hadn't died.
Oh.
I mean, we don't talk about that, but we all represent what Vinnie would have been if he had not died. So he gets to see what his uncle would have been like when there's no other way. Many uncles died in Vietnam
Yeah.
who are not still alive. Ralph and this project have kept Vincent alive, and my friends all know it. Anyway, there's my pontificating. Sorry.
Well, I'd like to thank you for being on my show and writing this excellent history book. It may not be, it's nonfiction or is fiction? It's fiction, right?
It's fiction based on the stories that Michael and Tony and John told me. And it's also based on the letters that Vinnie wrote to my mother. Every chapter begins with a verbatim recitation of the letter. And then I would extrapolate from the tenor of that letter stories that I wrote. And a lot of those stories were based on accounts that Mike told me. But I will say that there are a few accounts in that book that are actually true. And one of them is the manner in which my uncle died. And that's chapter 17. And I made sure that that chapter it's a reverent part of that book, because the manner in which Vinnie died is based on the memories that unfortunately Mike lives with every day, the memories that Tony Malazzo lives with every day, and John Nunn. And I will say that both John Nunn and Tony Malazzo were corpsmen. So their job was to run into battles when men are dropping and try to save lives, completely disregarding their own safety.
Yeah.
And so Tony and John Nunn both told me that they were sorry. And when I asked them why they were apologizing, they said, we're sorry that we didn't save your uncle. And obviously my uncle was beyond saving at that point in time. He was very, very terribly injured. But to hear those men say that speaks to their character. And I tried to pay homage and to give honor to those men in that chapter that discussed how Vinnie passed away, because in my eyes, I am now there. I wasn't there, but through the eyes of Michael and Tony and John, I was able to feel what they felt. And it wasn't a good feeling. It wasn't a good feeling writing that. I cannot imagine what it was like for Michael to have to see that, and for Tony and John Nunn to have to try to save my uncle when, again, there was just no way he was going to be saved. So that, again, is part of the experience of the book. And that is something that I think is very important. You know, Mike called it a history book, and in many ways it is.
In a way.
And it's also a book of appreciation, because I want people to hear and understand the great sacrifices that men like Mike made, the great sacrifices that someone like John Chang made. When he came home, there's a part of the book that, again, it's a fiction, but it's based on John's memory of the way he was treated when he came back home, and the way he was treated when he was trying to serve at my uncle's wake and funeral. And so it's important for people to hear that, because that's part of the human experience. That's part of who we are as Americans, whether it's good or bad. It's part of our history. It's part of our fabric, and it needs to be explored and felt and appreciated, for sure.
Shown. Have people listen to realize what it had really happened and why. I would like to thank you, Ralph Morales and Michael Reagan, for coming on to my show. I like to keep in touch with you guys, if I may.
You know where I'm at.
Absolutely.
Anyways, we love you. And there's a dog. Okay.
Was that
We
your
love
dog?
you.
That wasn't your husband barking, right?
We
That
have
was me.
cats, so I know, let me in. Okay, well, thank you for coming on to my show, and I'll keep in touch, and we'll let you know when this is going to be aired. Okay, God bless you all.
Thank you, Patty.
May the Lord be
Thanks,
with you.
Patty.
Thank you. Mike, great to see you, my friend.
You too, pal. I love you, man.
Love you too.
Talk to you
See you
later.
next week, people, and
Bye.
God bless you too. We love you guys, and take care of yourself now. Here.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Godspeed, my love, until we meet again. You're always in my heart and every dream. Don't let this time apart give in to all our fears. God will keep us close from up above. So until we meet again, Godspeed, my love. God is with us always, and for the rest of